Welcome to my tutorial on how to create a vintage-inspired watercolor mixed media artwork on antique paper. The first step is to find antique paper that will serve as the foundation for our artwork. I love going to my local antique mall for this, where I've been coming for a couple of years, but you can also find antique papers at flea markets or estate sales. When looking for antique paper, there are a couple of things you need to consider. The paper type is most notable. Consider the thickness, sheen, and if it is absorbent or not. You also want to make sure that the paper will survive being remounted on a panel. Sheet music is a great choice as they have recognizable type imagery and are in large sheets. Postcards work great too, as landscapes make wonderful secondary images, plus they are typically on thicker paper. Old catalogs are my favorite as they often feature beautiful advertisements and provide a variety of subject matter. I prefer paper from the late 1800s or early 1900s because during that time, you mostly see hand-illustrated images and not a lot of use of photographs. The catalogs are also normally in grayscale, making them perfect for building imagery on top. Consider the size of the paper, as well as any tears, stains, or creases that may add extra character to your final piece. It's important to find antique paper that showcases the texture and charm of the era. I carefully selected a page from an antique Woman's Home Companion magazine, which had a lightweight newsprint texture and a slightly rough edge. The interior section of this page was still in great quality, so I chose the largest salvageable area, which measured to be about 9 by 12 inches, a perfect size for a standard panel. Using a pencil, I marked off my desired area and proceeded to cut around the shape with scissors, taking extra care as antique paper can easily tear. For this type of project, there are several acrylic mediums that will work well, but my personal favorite to use is Golden's Fluid Matte Medium. To begin, I pour a generous amount of medium onto my unprimed birch panel. Since the panel is unprimed, it will absorb a lot of the medium, so be sure to thoroughly coat it and give it time to soak in. Keep spreading that matte medium until it's evenly applied, including around the edges. Before placing the paper on the panel, I like to do a mock lineup to make sure it's properly aligned. When you're ready to place the paper on the panel, gently press it down with your hands, starting from the center and working outwards. As that paper absorbs the matte medium, it may shrink slightly depending on what type of paper you're using. If you're working with an absorbent paper like newsprint, I'd recommend applying a layer of matte medium on top of the paper to seal it in place. This step will act as an additional isolation coat to help that paper retain its property and even out the surface. Remember that imperfections are part of the charm of using antique materials, so don't be distressed if there are stains, wrinkles, or tears that appear. Once the matte medium on your panel is completely dry, it's time to trim any excess paper around the edges. Flip the panel over and use an X-Acto blade to carefully cut off any overlapping paper. Hold the panel firmly with one hand to avoid any accidental movement that could damage the fragile paper. Remember to use a new X-Acto blade to ensure a clean cut. If you're planning to use watercolors on your panel, it's important to apply a transparent watercolor ground at this stage. I highly recommend using the one from Daniel Smith. For acrylic or oil paintings, you can use transparent gesso. Apply enough layers to create a smooth surface, but avoid overdoing it as too many layers can result in a milky appearance that will make the paper beneath appear cloudy. Now it's time to transfer your design onto the panel. You can use transfer paper or sketch it out directly with a pencil. Use a kneaded eraser to ensure the lines are clear enough for legibility, but not too dark, as they may show through the watercolor later. Creating artwork on antique paper can be very challenging as it requires much planning, patience, but the results are worth it. One of the most important things to keep in mind is working transparent to opaque. This allows you to choose what shows through and what is hidden. Think about the illustration you're creating as a sculpture from the paper beneath it. You choose what to carve out and what to sculpt in. To do this, you'll want to work thin to thick, so your mediums can build on top of each other. Let's start with watercolors. Use thin washes to create the basic structure of your image, building up color and depth gradually. Then move on to something more opaque, such as gouache or acrylic ink, to add more solid areas and details. Finally, use colored pencils to help build up tones and establish values, giving you complete control over what parts of the paper are showing through. When working on antique paper, clarity is key. You'll need to develop additional contrast, depth, and form to make your images stand out from the background. Keep your viewer in mind as you paint, and think about whether your image will be clear and impactful or confusing and hard to read. You might want to consider whether you want your antique paper and your artwork to compete with each other or to complement each other. I also wanted to talk about some important details when using watercolor ground. Unlike watercolor paper, it can only accept a limited amount of layers, 3 at the maximum. It's very different than working on cotton paper. This watercolor ground is the best I've ever tried, but it still has its limitations. If you plan to do a lot of glazing or layering, it's important to plan ahead or consider using a thicker medium like gouache or acrylic ink to layer up your colors after your first initial pass in watercolor. Keep in mind that colored pencils can also scrape off the ground if it's too wet, so it's best to let your painting fully dry before using them. Watercolor pencils can be a great choice for refining select areas in your painting, and you can even soften their edges afterwards with water once they're in place. When it comes to choosing the right paper to paint on, the subject matter of the underlying image is crucial. I prefer grayscale, monochromatic, or sepia papers with low contrast, as it allows me to create a dominant image on top that stands out against the background. However, if you choose a dark image, you'll just need to add more highlights and deeper shadows to your artwork to help differentiate between the two. Additionally, consider the concept of the paper itself. For this illustration, the paper I used is a love story featuring a couple sitting under a tree. I read the article before I cut it up, and essentially what it talks about is the man's expectations of the woman and how she didn't think that she met them, but in his mind, she did. So I kind of incorporated this story into my artwork by positioning my female's renditions, her head, over that image of the couple on the antique paper, almost as though if she was remembering their time together. I left snippets of the story visible around the edges of my painting, and my theme was centered around the idea of expectations, which is why I painted the female character as disheveled yet beautiful. Also, to emphasize the garden's setting, I added roses and foliage to her hair. So by carefully selecting your paper and incorporating your subject matter into your artwork, you create a cohesive and meaningful piece of art that resonates with your viewers. Composition may be the most essential element when working with multiple layered images. That's why I used transfer paper to carefully line up my sketch to the mounted paper. I loved that line detail border and wanted to position that directly through her left eye to draw the viewer's attention. There's something so beautiful about the straight line surrounded by all of the organic detail and script of the paper beneath. I often wonder if it is decent to use antique paper in this way, but then I remember that it was in a forgotten, dusty corner. And at least this way, it will be appreciated and given a new life. I hope these tips help you if you decide to try a project like this. Thank you kindly for watching till the end, and please feel free to give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the painting. And I hope you have a wonderful week.